Aloha once again and welcome back to the 7th Direction. My name is still David and we are focused here on going in our 7th direction. What does that mean? That means we're going inside of ourselves that way in what the Native American referred to as the 7th direction, as opposed to the 6 with which we are all familiar: north, south, east, west, up and down. The last one is the one that's going to provide us most of our answers, and for a lot of people who have spent some time on this planet, that might not come as a surprise, since looking around you don't necessarily find the ones you're looking for. It can be hard to interpret what happens to you, and that's why having those principles that we talked about the other day, where you're pono in everything you say and you do, you don't make assumptions, you don't take things personally, you always do your best, you make your decisions based in love, not fear, you keep your big picture in mind, and you never forget for a second that you are a spiritual being having a human experience, not a human being having a spiritual one, and that does not change ever based on your mood. Truth is truth no matter what. Which of those principles we choose to apply at any one time depends on the circumstance that we're in, but the purpose of having the principles is to apply them in our 3D real world life, so that the experience that we're having in this body, even if this experience, this body, is not the totality of what we are, we still want to have this be a positive experience for us. So that is our intention at all times, is to do our best, which is guideline number 4. How do we do that? We are usually implementing our understanding of some of those other principles. In the last podcast, I mentioned I'm just a regular guy. I was a busted out commodities trader. I mentioned at a certain point I was a grass cutting person. So how did all that change? How did I use the principles? Well, it took some practice. I was meditating for several years before I got it right. In fact, I started meditating in 1993. I was cutting grass in 1996, maybe, something like that. So it took a while before I ultimately figured it out. And it had to be something actually mystical that happened. I had put myself in a terrific little karmic spiral. After I was no longer a commodities trader, I became a writer. And I wound up connecting with a gentleman who had a lot of connections into Hollywood. And somehow, week after week, month after month, year after year, I was writing scripts, not earning money, writing scripts, sort of waiting for something to happen through this connection. And I had gone from cutting grass to doing some carpentry. It was all not very happy situation. And I was in Boise, Idaho, waking up one morning, and I saw what I thought was the spirit of this screenwriting friend and mentor, the one I was waiting for to help me out. I saw his spirit appear at the foot of my bed, and he said the words, "I'm sorry," and he disappeared. And I actually thought that meant he was dead. Well, so there wasn't much point in waiting for him to be doing something for me anymore. It turned out, I heard from him years later in a very unusual circumstance, so he wasn't actually dead. But I got the message clearly enough, and so I realized that was the sign, whatever it was, to finally get me out of my waiting spiral of not doing anything and not taking power, not making a choice. I had to do something, so what did I do? Well, I tried to get a job, and it turned out the only jobs around paid very, very little. And I had the voice of fear constantly talking to me, saying, you need to take any job that you can get. And the only jobs were $8 an hour. I was a former commodities futures trader. Once upon a time, a good one, before I busted out. $8 an hour is what I'm looking at, and something in me is saying, you know you are worth 10 bucks an hour. You're going to be the best $10 an hour person that anybody ever saw. And in any case, if you wait an extra week looking for a $10 an hour job and you find one, then you'll make up all that money after 4 weeks. Because 4 weeks at $10 is the same as 5 weeks at $8. So once I have passed that point, now I'm ahead. So I'll take an extra week and I will look for my $10 an hour job. Well, it turned out that I had made some friendly connections, and the phone rang one day, and it was a girl who said she worked for an employment agency and she had a job that paid $10 an hour. And it was at a bank, and I took it. That job, which was as a secretary in the commercial loan department, led me to being a programmer directly. Because part of that job was working with a program called Access. Access is a program from Microsoft that you can use if you know how, if you care, if you work. You can use it as a gateway to becoming a programmer. So in effect, I was learning it. At the same time, I was getting paid to do the work. I became a programmer. Programming pays a lot more than being a secretary. And all I did was follow up when that path blossomed. And it continues to blossom for me. So, which principles did I use there? Well, first and foremost, I had to admit I was no longer a commodities trader. That was something I had to completely leave behind. I couldn't be anything connected to that identity anymore, or I would never have been able to accept the role of being a secretary. I had to accept the role of being a secretary, and I had to be a good one. Because if I wasn't successful at it, I was nowhere. That attitude, being willing to do all my work in the first 4 hours of the day, when I could have stretched it out to 8 hours, allowed me to have the 4 hours a day to focus on doing this access work that was sort of optional, but it was educational, and I knew what it was doing for me because I was getting paid $10 an hour. But there was a girl who worked in the commercial loan department, and her husband was a programmer, and he got paid $17.50. That is one of the biggest raises you can ever get in your life, from $10 to $17.50. You go from not being able to afford anything, literally not being able to pay your bills, to maybe being able to have a pizza once a week if you want. And it kept on going from there. It got to the point where I went back to that programmer, her husband, who had helped me so much when I was in a position of needing help, and I kept wanting to help him and say, let me teach you all the things I'm learning, and he didn't have the same attitude, so he didn't wind up reaping all the benefits of learning all of the fantastic new technologies I've had the opportunity to learn over the years, because I'm a programmer and I've embraced the idea that that is a path of abundance and that it's blossoming for me, and that's all very positive. So that's how I got from there to here. So when I share the principles of life that I'm using to be happy and successful living that life in Hawaii, is my life perfect? No. Are all my choices perfect? No, not close. Do other people who speak to me seem to think that in general I'm having a positive experience? Yes. From that standpoint, did I think maybe it's a good idea if I share it? Yes. My experience has been a good one going in the 7th direction. Stepping more into my power, stepping more into myself, getting in touch with some principles, reducing my level of fear. Listen, when you discover you're an immortal soul, the first thing you lose is your fear of death, and for most people, that's a pretty big one. So, when you overcome your fear of death, everything else sort of, falls in comparison to be not too dramatic to deal with. So, going in the 7th direction has been fruitful for me. I hope going in the 7th direction is fruitful for you. Practice every day, do your meditations. It'll lead to positive outcomes. I hope you're having a good day. We'll talk again. Aloha.